A certain niche we've seen in the earlier part of the game was the introduction of elemental buffers. In addition to the 5-star Shenhe's cryo buffing, we have 4-stars Sara, Goro, and Faruzan, who work best as electro, geo, and animal buffers respectively. For this video, I'll be making my own signature weapons for them, and hopefully my ideas go beyond the expectations of elemental supports and explore the more unique aspects of their kit. As always, disclaimers, timestamps, social media links, and music credits are down below, so without further ado, let's get started. Sara is mainly known for her general attack base buff, her C6's electro crit damage bonus, and being hard locked in Raiden banners. Her support potential tends to lean more towards electro-based teams, more specifically, Raiden. But her kit is still designed in such a way that's general enough for other characters to capitalize on, so I made sure that her weapon was reflected as such. Tengu's Loyalty has a 620 base attack and a 15.3% energy recharge bonus. For its passive, it'll grant an additional 12 to 24% ER bonus, which just helps boost the energy needs. But for its actual passive, when the user casts their skill or burst, the next character to swap in gains a stack of Black Feather. Generating flat energy for a party member also grants them a stack of Black Feather. At 1 or 2 stacks, Black Feather increases all elemental damage based on 6/14 to 12/28% of the user's ER. Each stack lasts for 10 seconds, and stack durations are timed individually. Stacks can be granted even if the user is off-field. This particular weapon has a flexible roster of usable characters, as practically any unit who builds ER works well with it. But I added some aspects to make it synergize a bit more with Sara. For starters, the base attack is the highest possible for a 4-star, which is 620. By 4-star standards, this will scale the best with her base attack to flat attack bonus. Then for its passive, the first part naturally works with her, since its only requirement is swapping to the next character. But the second part is tied to her A4 passive's energy mechanic. When she hits enemies with her skill, she generates a very minuscule amount of energy to the entire party. By itself, it's a pretty shitty bonus, but in regards to the weapon, it'll have a lot of value. Because she has this specific bonus, she can activate the second part of the passive, and since this energy regen affects the entire team, everyone gets a partial buff for a while. Meanwhile, the next character Sara swaps into has the full amount for the bonus. For general number showcases, this is how much better Raiden's damage is when Sara has the weapon. The first column shows her buffing with Elegy. The second column is Sara running an ER Sands and her signature to maximize the scaling. And the third column is an attack Sands with her signature, which helps buff Sara's personal damage in exchange for support utility. From what's shown here, the ER Sands column buffs Raiden's damage by 14%, while the attack Sands column buffs her damage by around 9%. That's most of the info on Sara herself, but for the best alternative users, any character who has to build a lot of ER will make good use of this weapon's first part. But the only bow user who can utilize the second part is Venti, due to his A4 passive also having an energy regen effect. His interaction with the weapon is a little worse than Sara's for a few reasons. First of all, he's required to absorb the element of the teammate he's buffing. So let's say I want to buff Raiden's damage, but I'm running a Taser team, which naturally includes Hydro units. If Venti were to accidentally absorb Hydro instead, then Raiden won't have the energy regen, making her unable to get the full bonus. The second thing has to do with timing and rotations. If you use his burst, then the buffed character will get the bonus, but by the time the burst ends, you'll only have 2 seconds for the full buff. If you want to maximize his buff, you'd have to cast his burst, set up your rotation, then wait for his burst to end and recharge the energy. Then, you have to swap back into Venti, use his skill, and this will give you better uptime on the full bonus. When I calculated the numbers, here's what I found. If you can grant the full buff on a character, Venti's buffing potential is around 7% better than Elegy, his signature. But if you only get 1 stack, then it's around 10% worse than Elegy. Usually I try to ensure the weapon is only best in slot on the intended character, but I'm making a bit of an exception for Venti. In order to make it his best in slot, you have to take into account what element he swirls, what team he's running, and whether that team is able to slot in a quick swap for the bonus. In other words, there's a lot more strategizing needed. If you're able to use the right team and rotation, you get rewarded with a buff that's better than Elegy, but if you want something a bit more general for all of Venti's teams, Elegy will be a lot better. Aside from the main aspects of the bow, I think the big thing that makes this perfect for Sara is the consistency. You don't have to heavily focus on managing your team rotations. As long as you play Sara normally, you'll most likely be able to utilize the buff to the fullest extent. That's gonna do it for Sara's weapon, so next up is Goro. Goro is best known as the optimal Geo support, providing a variety of offensive and defensive buffs, and is also known for being hardlocked in Itto banners. His kit and teams are pretty straightforward as he's tailored towards triple Geo or mono Geo comps. And it's pretty easy to make a weapon surrounding mono teams, but it was a bit too easy for me, and we'd be delving into similar territory with Linny's bow. It might be a little more complicated, but I did want to take a slightly different approach. Goro's weapon will be called Dogs of War. It'll have a 454 base attack with a 69% defense bonus. For its passive, when the user applies at least 1, 2, or 3 buffs to any ally other than themselves, they will increase the entire party's damage based on 9/18/30% to 18/36/60% of the user's defense. Each stack lasts for 10 seconds, and the durations are counted independently. Buffs that affect the same stat or attribute will refresh the duration, but will not be able to stack the effect. And buffs provided by external sources, such as artifacts or resonances, will not be counted. While I didn't directly focus on the mono-elemental aspect of Goro's kit, this weapon still ties into that, due to Goro providing buffs depending on how many Geo teammates there are. But this approach manages to expand on an unexplored aspect, which is buffception. In other words, the amount of buffs you give grants another buff. Before we explore how this weapon works on Goro and other characters, let's quickly explore what a buff would be defined as in Genshin. You're welcome to have your own take, but for me personally, a buff would be something that directly enhances a character's own performance in combat. For example, the classic stat bonuses are considered buffs because it directly affects a character's ability to deal damage, resist damage, etc. Things like healing and shielding are not considered buffs, because they don't impact the affected character's performance. It's more of an external sustainability. However, incoming healing and shield strength bonuses are buffs, since it affects a character's ability to receive healing or reinforce a shield that they have. Energy is a complicated one, but here's my take on it. ER bonuses are buffs, since it affects a character's ability to convert particles into energy, but a flat energy bonus such as Dori's Burst or Sara's A4 isn't a buff because it's not improving a character's performance in any way. In a sense, the bonus is kind of like another form of sustain, but instead of like healing, it's for energy. At the end of the day though, the whole energy debate doesn't even apply to Goro himself. It's more associated with Sara and Venti and their ability to use the weapon. Anyway, let's cover what Goro provides as buffs. Level 1 is his defense bonus, which is a direct stat buff for characters. Level 2 is an interruption resistance bonus, which is a special defensive bonus but still considered a buff since it affects a character's ability to resist stagger or stun. Level 3 is the damage bonus, and that should be straightforward enough. So this means in his regular triple Geo comps, he's already maxing out the stacks. Additionally, the duration is the same as his skill, so there's no weird downtime issues. Everything will line up accordingly. In terms of his other abilities, his A1 passive allows him to grant the team a 25% defense bonus after using his burst, but as stated in the passive, things that buff the same attribute only refresh the duration, so his A1 isn't going to do much for the weapon aside from maybe stack uptime. His A4 gives him a defense scaling bonus to his damage, but getting weapon stacks requires him to buff other characters, so this also doesn't work on him. However, his C6 will allow him to buff the team's Geo crit damage. The stacks max out at 3 anyway, so it's not like it matters too much, but since the Geo crit damage is its own buff, this opens up an option to run double Geo and still max out the stacks. To give you an idea on its buffing, I'll show you numbers for Albedo, Itto, and Chiori. For all of these, assume everyone's running 4-piece Husk and their signature weapons. Goro's build is also on Husk, and we'll look at his buffing if you build him on a defense damage crit build versus a full defense one. For Albedo, his damage increases by 15% when Goro's running a damage build, and around 21% when you fully build defense. For Itto, it's around 13% better with the damage build, and 18% better with the defense build. Finally, for Chiori, it's around 22% better with the damage build, and 31% better with the defense build. Overall, these are some pretty big number changes for all the characters. Maybe it's a little too overpowered, but I did lean more towards the higher end of buffing since Mono Geo isn't the most meta team out there. Anyway, let's cover the best alternative users. Since the bonus is defense scaling, there's no amazing users, but I will go down a list of characters who can at least activate 2 or 3 stacks. Diona can provide 3 buffs at C6. Her A1 applies movement speed buffs and stamina consumption reduction, which are 2 buffs. Then at C6, she grants either an incoming healing or EM bonus. At least one of those being applied will make it to 3 stacks. C6 Amber provides a movement speed bonus and an attack bonus, making 2 stacks. Sara has her attack buff, and C6 provides the electro crit damage, which also makes 2 buffs. Yelan has her damage bonus, and at C4 she gets a second stack with her max HP buff. But let's be real, C4 Yelan isn't that commonplace, so you're only getting 1 stack as a general player. Finally, Faruzan is an interesting case. She has her burst, which provides animal damage percent, but she also has her A4 passive, which is an animal base damage bonus. I mentioned earlier that since Goro's skill and A1 both buff defense, it counts as one category for buffing. So since both of Faruzan's abilities buff Anemo damage, does it follow the same logic by only counting as one stack, or are we counting it as 2 stacks? Wait, why am I even doing this? Let's just move on to her signature weapon. Faruzan's gonna end off our list, and she's best known for being an Anemo damage buffer, as well as being hard locked to Wanderer banners. Oh, wait a minute, she broke the trend. Good for her. Mostly. In addition to her buffing potential, there's also her insanely high energy requirements. But since a various amount of weapons, artifacts, and even her constellations can already address these, I chose to have her signature focus on a different aspect of her kit. The Century Stagnant has a 510 base attack and a 45.9% energy recharge bonus, and this is the only part of her weapon that actually addresses energy needs. When the user applies a debuff onto enemies, the active character will ignore a portion of that affected enemy's defense, scaling with 12 to 24% of their own element's elemental damage bonus. This lasts for as long as the debuff is active, and debuffs coming from external sources will not count. So there's going to be a lot of debate on what is considered a debuff. Marks, elemental auras, certain reactions all have arguments on being debuffs, but just as many points where it's not considered as one. For the sake of keeping it simple, I'm just going to focus on stat debuffs for now, because that's very straightforward and universally agreed upon. You know, things like attack reduction, defense shred, and more specific to Faruzan, res shred. This particular weapon is focused on Faruzan's ability to apply a res shred onto enemies, which is surprisingly not as common in a lot of the other bow users' kits. In order to activate her weapon, she just needs to use her burst or A1 passive to apply the res shred. The burst is, of course, more reliable because it can refresh the duration. After we activate the passive, the active character gains a defense ignore, scaling with their own elemental damage bonus, and Faruzan also has a leg up in this. Her burst also grants her team an Anemo damage bonus, so her fellow DPS units get a slightly larger increase in the defense ignore buff. Here's an example of Faruzan buffing Wanderer, who's running his signature weapon and a 4-piece Desert Pavilion. If we assume Faruzan's at C6 and her burst is town level 11, her Anemo damage bonus is 34.2%. Combined with Wanderer's own damage bonuses, he adds up to 95.8% Anemo damage bonus, so his defense ignore is around 23% better. When plugging in the numbers, his damage is around 13% higher when Faruzan uses the weapon. If we look at Xiao on Vermilion, you'll notice the difference is only 11% higher, and this is because he lost out on the 15% Anemo damage bonus that Desert provided. If he were to run the same set, the defense ignore would have been the same. For the most part, I'm only bringing this up because it shows you that running artifacts or weapons that provide elemental damage percent bonuses will provide more value when Faruzan has this weapon. For Wanderer, comparing Tula and Lost Prayer at 3 stacks has a 9% difference in damage, but when the bow is present, the difference is only around 5%. Same thing with Xiao. Prospector's Drill would be around 10% worse than Jade Spear, but with the bow, it's closer to 4% worse. While it doesn't make these weapons a new best in slot, double dipping the damage percent bonus helps close the gap and makes certain weapons more viable. For alternative users, Diona's A4 has an attack debuff, which means that she can activate the passive. Her A4 lasts for 15 seconds, which is a pretty good duration for the active character to capitalize on. Aloy has a similar debuff in which her bombs decrease attack, but this debuff only lasts for 6 seconds, making downtime a lot more prevalent. Finally, Venti, Sigewinne, Ganyu, and Lyney are all 5 stars with res shred, but these are locked behind constellations, which means only the whales can capitalize on this weapon for them. Alright, that's gonna do it for this video. I had a lot of fun reimagining some of the mechanics, especially the buffing and debuffing aspect for Goro and Faruzan, and hopefully you liked seeing me expand on those ideas as well. If you enjoyed, consider leaving a like and subscribe to support the channel. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, what you liked or what you would change. Thanks again for watching everyone, and I'll see you next time. Bye!